Hello, Axis and Allies fans. This is NATO on the CIC, and there'll be the start of the second map, Wars and Scenarios. There'll be a little different format than the first map, a little less polished, quote unquote. I'm not saying the first set of videos was overly polished, but on the videos for the first map, I would have kind of a historical intro with period-specific clips from movies and documentaries playing in the background, and kind of like a actual pre-written essay on the background of the conflict. I'm not going to be doing that for this and pretty much the rest of the maps because maps 2, 3, and 4 are still very much in the testing phase. Map 1 is pretty much done and set in stone and ready. 2, 3, and 4, this is 2, are not. They are very much still in the testing phase. Things are being still rewritten left and right. So because of that, I'm going to be a little more informal when I'm doing the kind of the historical background for the conflicts. It's just going to be kind of impromptu. Not going to write out a coherent essay beforehand and read from a script. I'm just going to just go off the top of my head from memory of the conflicts. They're going to be a lot more informal. Hope you guys are okay with that. But with that, we will get to the first conflict for the second map, the first Sino Japanese War, and then the optional conflict, the Scramble for Africa, going on in the background. So see you then. Welcome back, Axis and Allies players. This is NATO on the CIC, and this is the first Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. And this is the first real scenario for this second map. There's an optional scenario, the Scramble for Africa, that I mentioned last video. But so this is a general consequences of all the wars from the first map. Japan has been unified after the Boshin War, and as part of the Meiji Restoration has gone full force into modernizing its military. So you see modern cruisers, modern ships, factories, naval bases, modern artillery, modern infantry, whole 9 yards. Japan doesn't actually have this half of the island yet. That's a result of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. Because the British losing the First Boer War, they still don't have, well, they do and don't have control of the Transvaal. The treaty that was signed basically said that the British would have jurisdiction over foreign affairs, so treaties and whatnot, but the Boers would effectively have autonomy within the Transvaal. I see the unification of Germany as the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War. The Austrian and Hungarian thrones unifying into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And you see the Ottomans losing more and more territory. As of right now, 1894, the Balkans don't look like this. This is the borders after the Second Balkan War in 1913. But when we get closer to that event, there's a overlay / blow up that has the correct borders. As you can see, the scramble for Africa is going strong. But to the main focus of this video, the first Sino Japanese War. Now the impetus for this, it was fought primarily over Korea. For centuries, Korea had been basically a puppet state of China. China basically controlled Korea. It was technically an independent kingdom, but Korea paid yearly tributary to China, and Korea couldn't do hardly anything without Chinese approval first. So China viewed Korea as very much part of their backyard, their jurisdiction, their influence. Now Japan's interest in Korea had a lot to do with, at least from the Japanese perspective, national security, because literally every single time Japan had been invaded by a mainland power, it had come from Korea. It makes sense. That's the shortest distance navally between the mainland and Japan is the Korean Peninsula. And whenever you're making a amphibious invasion, you want that distance of water that you have to travel to be as short as possible. Makes logistics easier. So literally every time Japan has been invaded in the past, it has come from Korea. So Japan obviously has an interest in Korea because they're tired of getting invaded. And granted, that is a massively simplified explanation of Japan's interest in Korea. It had more than just defense involved. There was economics, the ongoing struggle between the Asian world and the Western European world, and the Asians, particularly Japan's desire to not be gobbled up like China had been. And they were afraid, because large sections of China had been more or less carved up by the Europeans. It's not reflected on this map, but I mean, European control went beyond just this little patch in Hong Kong and this little patch in this peninsula. It reached deeper into the interior, and Japan was afraid that eventually that European gaze would turn towards them, and that influence, that quasi-invasion, would come through Korea once again. And then the other half of Japan's interest in Korea is Japan. This is where Japan starts leaning towards imperialistic goals, where they wanted to expand their control, their territory. They wanted to create an empire, and this also plays into Japan's fears of being swallowed by the Western powers. Japan thought that if they could put themselves on an equal footing with the European powers, that would shield them from invasion, influence, being carved up. Now, as with what's going on in Africa right now, one of the hallmarks of being considered a great power is you had to have colonies outside your main borders. Now, Japan, who had just the culmination of their of the Meiji Restoration, where they tried to modernize, and very successfully, their everything: government, military, society, economics, everything. Japan had this brand spanking new modern military, and they wanted to flex a little bit. They wanted to test this new army, this new military that they had. Now, Japan wasn't stupid, and they knew that even with this new modern military that they had, trained and supplied by the Western powers, they still at this moment didn't stand a chance against any of the Western powers. But China, they could win, potentially. And so Japan's gaze turned towards Korea, because that would accomplish all their goals in more or less one swell movement. It would allow them to flex their military, it would allow them to test it, and it would go a long way into securing their national security concerns. Now, China, on the other hand, hadn't, while it was the victor of the Taiping Rebellion, the Qing dynasty hadn't done a single thing to modernize since then. And that's despite being defeated twice by the British in the First and Second Opium Wars. Whether their victory over the Taiping lured the Chinese into a sense of complacency or overconfidence, who really knows? But large portions of the Qing army still had swords and bows as their primary weapons. They had guns, but they were so few and far between that predominantly the Qing military was still using swords, spears, and bows. So what ultimately caused this conflict in Korea was there was actually a revolt in Korea that escalated very, very quickly. And the Korean leadership asked China to militarily intervene in the revolt. China, considering Korea their sphere of influence in their backyard, sent troops to Korea. Well, this angered Japan, especially because this revolt had caused a good number of Japanese in Korea to be killed and murdered. Japan ended up sending troops to Korea as well. The revolt was put down primarily by Chinese forces, and then China and Japan came into conflict over the withdrawal of said troops, and they both, at least officially, agreed to withdraw their troops. China mostly did. Japan kind of half-heartedly did. And once again, I'm horrendously oversimplifying here, but it ended up in the two nations going to war over Korea over this. So that's where we find ourselves. A modernized Japan versus a medieval China. So we'll get the first round underway, and we'll come back with an update then. See you then. Welcome back, Axis Analyzed players. This is NATO on the CIC, and we are in the second end of the first turn of the Sino Japanese War. So, Qing Dynasty used its $11 to buy primarily cavalry, 2 cavalry and an infantry, because Qing Dynasty isn't industrialized. It has the benefit of being able to place stuff without a factory. Downside is they're limited to militia, infantry, and cavalry. So Qing, they bought 2 cavalry and infantry because cavalry is the only thing they have that can hit at something higher than a 1. Because Japan has total naval supremacy and Beijing, their capital, has a coastline, forced the Qing to place their 2 cavalry in Beijing to guard against, in case Japan goes for the capital. If Japan takes Beijing, that's pretty much game over. But it doesn't really hurt Qing too much in counterattacking in Korea because they have a movement of 2, so 1-2 they can get to Korea anyways. So what happened? Qing moved into Korea, occupied it, and then Japan used its 11 IPCs to buy 2 artillery and infantry, and then took its existing force, landed in Korea, and then with a combination of artillery and offshore bombardment from its cruisers, completely obliterated the Qing forces. Like, they couldn't even fight back. The artillery and the cruiser bombardment has first strike. And the Qing can only bring 2 units into Korea. Whoops. Because everything else was didn't have the movement range, so the Qing only had an infantry and a cavalry in there. So Qing moved in, occupied Korea. Japan did an amphibious landing, kicked them right back out. This is a very short war, it's only 2 turns. So Qing's only chance is, because this is their last turn, is an all-out attack on Korea. And because of movement, ranges, and there's rail lines printed on the map, but they haven't been built yet. They won't be built until after this conflict. I mean, there are some rail lines in China, but they're so dispersed and, say, unproficient, to put it lightly, that they played 0 factor in this conflict. So the only thing the Qing can bring to bear is 4 infantry and 2 cavalry against 3 infantry and an artillery. Now, all that infantry is hitting at a 1, cavalry is hitting at a 2, versus Japan's infantry hitting at a 2 and its artillery hitting at a 3. So, I mean, it's possible, but Qing get a really good roll, but it's highly unlikely. And then the reinforcements coming from Japan, probably a pretty decent chance of wiping out whatever Qing forces there are. So we'll do this last turn and come back with the results and see who wins the first Sino Japanese War. See you then. Welcome back, Axis and Allies players. This is NATO and the CIC, and the Japanese have won. China, the Qing, they almost pulled it off. They attacked Japanese in Korea and reduced them all the way down to 1 infantry and 1 artillery. but it just wasn't quite enough, and so then, I mean, the game was effectively over at that point. I didn't really need to do Japan's turn, but I did it anyways, because why pass up a good opportunity to throw some dice around? So Japan loaded its reinforcements, hopped across the pond, counterattacked, and returned the favor, reduced the Qing forces to 1 infantry and 1 cavalry. And took no losses in return. But with that, Korea is solidly in Japanese control, and Japan walks away with a victory. Now, this was important for several reasons. So we'll start with the Qing. Why it's important with the Qing dynasty. This victory, from the Qing's perspective, this defeat sent shockwaves through China, because China, or the Qing dynasty, had always been the dominant power of Asia, at least in the Asian corner. Obviously, the European powers are the dominant power, but from just a purely Asian corner, China, or the Qing, had always been the dominant power of Asia. Japan had always been the subservient, and for a lot of people in China, they view Japan as a backwater, just to use a modern term, full of rednecks. So when this supposedly backwater minor power took on the Qing China, not only won, but pretty much kicked the crap out of them, that sent shockwaves through China, to put it mildly. The big consequence for that is, this was extremely humiliating for the Chinese. And the big consequence of that is China, or the Qing, finally started looking into trying to modernize a little bit. Emphasis on the a little bit. There is still a large resistance in the Qing dynasty, mostly from the upper echelons of government and nobility, because any kind of major reform would mean a lot of them would lose their power and prestige. So there was a lot of resistance. Most of what little modernization reforms that the Qing did was centered around the military, trying to create a modern army, but very little else in any other categories like economy, government, infrastructure, education. All the institutions that would make modernization of anything sustainable, they flat refused to do that. And this humiliation, which just emboldened the European powers even more to get special privileges in China, would it be a big cause to the Boxer Rebellion that is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, about 4 years down the road. Then the losses, China from this point on loses its sphere of influence over Korea. That is now solidly in Japan's hand, and they signed over Formosa to Japan. So this island, Formosa, which is modern day Taiwan, is now Japanese. One of the major things that contributed to the Qing defeat, other than its military being obsolete, and that's putting it kindly, the Chinese army being confusing mix of modern, semi-modern, and downright medieval units going up against a 100% modern military. It really didn't stand a chance. The other reason that they lost and probably played a bigger part in why they lost than probably anything else was the vast majority of the Qing military never took part in the war. Despite the Qing having a much larger army than Japan, Japan, best estimates in terms of like combat fighting men that they could put in the field at this time, it was only around 300,000, give or take, and that's being fairly generous on my part. Whereas the Qing could call on well over 1 million. But the problem with that is those hundreds of thousands, that 1 million was spread out over half a continent. And China at this point in time, in terms of transportation, had virtually none. The military could move as fast as someone could walk. And even that was questionable because, just like in the Taiping Rebellion, the Qing's logistical ability was questionable. And so moving 1 million men relatively at the same time was virtually impossible for the Qing because they just could not logistically support that. So what that translated into is only a fraction of their total military was able to take part in the fighting in Korea, which meant that Japan, even outnumbered by a 3-to-1 margin in terms of manpower, had local superiority in terms of numbers virtually in the entire conflict because China could only get a fraction of its total strength to Korea, whereas Japan could concentrate 100% of it. On top of that, Japan being a 100% modern military with modern equipment, modern training, modern tactics, meant that the Qing really didn't stand a chance. If the Qing had been able to concentrate most of their forces, they might have been able to pull it off just by sheer weight of numbers, but outnumbered and fighting a superior enemy in every category, it just wasn't going to happen. For Japan, they came out of it. They gained influence over Korea. They basically controlled Korea at this point, and they get Formosa. But the bigger takeaway from that is Japan now became the dominant Asian power in Asia. It replaced China as the dominant power. This would embolden Japan pretty substantially, and more or less validated the Meiji Restoration. Any detractors from Japan shedding its ancestral ways and reforming along Western lines pretty much died after this. I mean, not literally, but the voices arguing against this pretty much evaporated overnight because of this victory. Never in Japan's history was it ever able to even consider fighting China, let alone winning. So for them to turn around and not just beat China but crush them, it validated the Meiji Restoration, and Japan would go full force in the future into modernizing and bringing itself to be an equal of any Western power. Arguably, it already is at this point, but the only thing that the Western powers have on Japan right now is just numbers. But anyway, so that's basically the first Sino Japanese War in a nutshell. As the title implies, first, that means there will be more. There will be a second, otherwise it wouldn't be a first. But the next conflict is the Spanish-American War. Yeah. So, we'll clear the board. The scramble for Africa is still ongoing, but we'll get the Spanish-American War set up, and that'll probably happen, or at least the video will be posted for it probably next week. So, thanks for watching. See you then.